I was one of the leaders of the effort in Washington, D.C. to enact civil marriage equality legislatively in the D.C. Council. And the Gay and Lesbian Activists Alliance was founded originally in 1971, so we're now 42 years old. We began advocating for marriage equality in 1975. By the way, all of the documents that I reference here are available online on GLAA's website. That's glaa.org. There's a timeline, for example, that my colleague Bob Summersgill prepared that goes all the way back to 1975 and talks about all the many different stages of what was a long-term struggle. We didn't just start it in 2009 when we actually introduced and passed marriage equality. It was decades in preparation, and it was a coalition. This appeared in color above the fold on the front page of the Washington Post on March 10th, 2010. This shows Rocky Galloway and Reggie Stanley and their little girls. Let me see. Their daughters' names are Milena and Zoe. This was at the Human Rights Campaign where the first same-sex marriages in D.C. were conducted. The first day when the law took effect was March 3rd, 2010, and there's a 3 full-day waiting period once you apply for the marriage license, and so the first actual weddings took place on the morning of March 9th, 2010. So the front page of the Washington Post the next morning had this photo. This was not accidental. One of the pieces of the overall coalition strategy was a media strategy, because we were working within Washington, D.C. to pass marriage equality, and we wanted to make sure that the media did not do what they often do in the past, which was erase the racial diversity of the LGBT community. Quite often, the media would treat the struggle for marriage equality as if the people for gay marriage were all rich white atheists. So they would set up the gay people, these white gay people on one side, and oftentimes African-American faith community leaders and members on the other side. And it would be portrayed as you have these rich people here and ordinary folks, and also that we were portrayed as if we all sort of parachuted into D.C. and we're not from here. And there were all these class-based and racial-based and religious-based divisions that our opponents tried to plant in the media as sort of assumptions that would drive the coverage and the way the headlines were written and the perspective from which the reporting would be done. And so when we were preparing for marriage equality, it was not just about policy. It was not just how should the law be worded. We had to deal with the diversity of the community in Washington. We had to anticipate the arguments and the untruths that would be told by our opponents. We had to deal with the fact that the United States Congress can step in, because all of the laws that are passed in D.C. are subject to being vetoed by the U.S. Congress. And so there was a lot of different angles that we had to account for when we were organizing this, to make sure we not only won, but we sustained the victory afterwards, to make sure that Congress would not overturn the law that we passed, and that there would not be a ballot measure that would have the entire city directly voting on the thing, because we believe that civil rights should not be subject to a vote. So the goal was full civil marriage equality, not imposing anything on any church or synagogue or mosque or temple. We were talking about the civil law. It's all based on separation between church and state under the First Amendment to the Constitution. Our equal marriage rights are based upon equal protection clauses in the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. And so it was very straightforward. We wanted the same rights and responsibilities for same-sex couples as already are taken for granted by opposite-sex couples. And so that's the overall purpose of our coalition. Now, speaking of coalition, there wasn't a single group in charge of this. Speaking of diverse communities, we had Democratic clubs, Republican clubs, GLAA, which I am president of, which is a nonpartisan advocacy group. But there were faith-based organizations, there were opinion leaders, so there were lots of different people that became involved. And the nature of coalition work meant that we simply coordinated what we were all variously doing. And community members and leaders and elders simply kept our eyes collectively on the prize. We couldn't tell each other what to do, so the point was for each group to do what it was interested in doing and what it had the gifts and the expertise to do, and then we simply coordinated our efforts. And that worked very well. I don't think it would work well at a state level. Even a relatively small state like Maryland really requires a professional effort because there's a huge legislature. In comparison to DC, we had 13 members of our city council. That's a much smaller scale and makes it easier for one person like me to actually know all of our legislators. So the volunteer model that we based our effort on, I don't think would translate into a statewide effort, but it worked well for us. But we did plan, we did contingency planning, including setting up a nonprofit foundation, independent group that would do voter research, polling, testing messages, and evaluating what different segments of the Washington population thought on the issue, so we could address that in our messaging and in our advocacy. And also setting up a campaign organization to run a campaign in case there was a ballot measure that we had to fight, or if we had to battle Congress, any effort to overturn the law once it passed. And we wanted not just to pass the law, we wanted a supermajority, an overwhelming majority of the DC Council to pass it, to show unity in the city. Our opponents, many of them come from outside. For example, one of the leading ministers against us was Bishop Harry Jackson, who's the pastor of a church in Maryland. And they often had support from right-wing evangelical groups that were trying to stir up the population of the city, especially the African-American population, in some sort of a backlash against this, liberal effort to pass gay marriage. And so we had to make sure that our own faith community was fully collaborating with us from the outset, and that any campaign organization that we set up, what reflected, the board of that organization from the outset reflected the full diversity of the city, which it did. But this was decades in preparation, and what made it possible for us to succeed is that we did not begin setting up coalitions a few years before we were ready to pass marriage equality. We've been doing it for decades, because a community that's as diverse as Washington has cultural, racial, religious, economic, all kinds of diversity. And so we had to make sure that we had built relationships of trust already before we were taking on such an ambitious job. And we had to anticipate what our opponents would do to try to divide us, the various wedges that they would try to divide our communities. We did, I think, a very good job of that collectively, and I'm very proud of the work that we did. So one of the first things that we did was legal research on the state of the law in DC. We spent a few $1,000s hiring someone to look through all the DC code. Every reference to marriage in the DC code, and there were more than 200, we documented this, and this was released at the very end of 2003, because we were going to improve things incrementally first by adding incrementally provisions to the domestic partnership law that we had passed in 1992. And once domestic partners, registered domestic partners, had every right and responsibility under DC law, we wanted to then proceed to full marriage equality, at least to the extent that DC can grant it, because there's about 1,300 federal rights and responsibilities under federal law. But of course, at the local or state level, we cannot control that. But at least we could have full marriage equality at the district level, and then whenever the Defense of Marriage Act is overturned, then will be already in place, and those that are married in the district will not have to do any other further legislation, just as if you're married in the state of Maryland as a same-sex couple and you're denied federal benefits, the moment that the Defense of Marriage Act is overturned as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court or legislatively by Congress, then those couples will automatically receive federal recognition because of the tradition of the federal government extending full faith and credit to the acts passed by the states. So that's the sort of the strategy. And in 2009, by that point, we had granted to registered partners in the district, domestic partners, all of the legal rights and responsibilities virtually that married couples could get. So instead of being a huge leap from nothing to marriage equality, it was simply the next logical step. And we'd already established several years in which, of experience in which people could see these same-sex families. And so there was familiarity with it. It wasn't this big new thing suddenly and we're pushing for marriage equality. It was just this organic final step in a long process. And that worked very well for us. So we did our homework, we did our preparation, we built relationships, and we did contingency planning for every possible problem that we could encounter. We wanted full marriage equality. And we did it by cooperating with others that were interested, by building relationships with opinion makers, public officials, and faith leaders. One of the things that we did, first of all, we used a lot of resources, including the World Wide Web, but we created we were very text-heavy in our organizing. We created a talking points flyer that had included 10 talking points, and we included references for defending DC marriage equality. And this was for ordinary citizens to use in talking with their fellow church members, their neighbors, their family members, to arm them with information and arguments. For example, and it has on the cover a quote from Representative John Lewis, who right now is in Selma, Alabama, as we're doing this interview. This is the beginning of March, for the 48th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, which occurred on March 7th, 1965. He and Hosea Williams were at the front of a line of 600 people crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, on the way to the state capitol in Montgomery to push for voting rights. This was in 1965. And John Lewis is one of the most eloquent supporters of marriage equality in Congress. We heard our fellow citizens, this is a quote from him, "We heard our fellow citizens and our community when we deny gay people civil marriage and its protections and responsibilities. Rather than divide and discriminate, let us come together and create one nation. We are all one people. We all live in the American house. We are all the American family. Let us recognize that the gay people living in our house share the same hopes, troubles, and dreams. It is time we treated them as equals, as family." And the arguments and there's detail provided for each one. To thank and reward our allies for their support, first of all. We always thank our officials. We don't just gripe at them. We find something to thank them for. We point out that DC voters have long supported diversity and inclusiveness, including equal rights for their LGBT neighbors. More than 200 DC clergy have signed a declaration of support for marriage equality, we quoted from that. No religious organization is required to conduct or approve of same-sex marriages. This was essential. Now, the law didn't have to say that. The bill did not have to say that because no law can trump the First Amendment. The First Amendment includes protection for religious freedom. So any law that would interfere with a church's right to decide its own doctrines would violate the. We also talked about the ministers led by Bishop Harry Jackson who were carpetbagging, that is, who were not based in D.C., who came to D.C. to divide the community in D.C. we talked about how demographic trends favor marriage equality. Our opponents had argued, prior to last November, had argued that every time the issue of marriage equality had come before the states, before voters in the states, it had lost, it had been defeated. That was 31 times. And what we pointed out was, if you go back a dozen years and look at the vote margins then, and then more recently, each election cycle, the margin of victory of the anti-gay forces was more narrow. So with older voters cycling off of the voter rolls and new, younger voters coming onto the voter rolls, and society shifting on these issues by the discussion, by the cultural exposure of same-sex families, gradually the numbers of voters voting for gay marriage and gay and lesbian equality were increasing. So even though we kept losing for many years, the margin of those losses was narrowing, and until finally this past November, there were 4 state ballot measures, and the pro-gay side won all 4. And this was the election after the President of the United States had publicly endorsed marriage equality, and also the National Board of Directors of the NAACP also last May, in May of 2012, endorsed marriage equality. So that was a natural progression of the demographic shift, for one thing, and the shift of public opinion. And then we argued that marriage helps people of all income levels, but provides the most help to couples with the fewest financial resources. This was an argument that many people tried to make as part of this sort of racial wedge to drive, to say that poorer people, or it's not a black issue, say that marriage is not something that black people are, gay marriage, are not in something that black people are interested in. But if you talk to black, gay, and lesbian people and couples in the district and elsewhere around the country, not just somebody who has a blog, but actual individuals, you find that they don't agree with that they recognize that they want legal protections for their relationships and their children, because many gay and lesbian couples are raising children, and they want the same legal protections that their neighbors are able to take for granted. So marriage, as somebody calls a poor man's lawyer, it grants couples a wealth of protections in one fell swoop that could otherwise take thousands of dollars and complicated legal instruments to have any close approximation of. And then if same-sex couples are not protected under the law, the birth family members of one partner, if one partner dies, can come sweeping in and throw out wills and protections and stuff traditionally, can take the joint property of the couple and leave the bereft, the surviving partner, in addition to being in an emotional state of mourning, can leave them with nothing. And this has happened many, many times over the years. During the AIDS crisis, which began in the early 80s, quite often when a couple, even if they'd been together for many, many years, when one of them would die of AIDS, the family, who often disapproved of their, for example, their son's homosexuality, would come in and take everything and prohibit the surviving partner from even attending the funeral. And that, of course, is especially devastating. And so having the legal protections makes a huge difference for actual families. And we talked about the polling that we had done that showed that the community overall in D.C. was not divided as starkly as our opponents like Bishop Harry Jackson tried to suggest. Some of these anti-gay faith leaders tried to portray the numbers of opinions as being, white people support gay marriage and black folks don't. That's just not true. If you did a poll, white Washingtonians were more likely to support marriage equality, and the African American community was more closely divided, leaning slightly against, but this was back in around 2005, 2006. But it was not overwhelming, and it was not monolithic. And over the years, support in all groups for equality has increased and improved. And also, we made the point that when same-sex couples choose marriage, we're embracing responsibility and strengthening families and communities. And we said that the claim that marriage has remained unchanged for millennia is preposterous. There have been, just in the past 50 years, no-fault divorce, decriminalization of adultery. Adultery remains a legitimate ground for a divorce, but it used to be a felony under D.C. law. It wasn't just grounds for, the jilted spouse to get a divorce. It was a criminal charge that you could be jailed for. So there have been, and the emancipation of women since Griswold v. Connecticut allowed married couples, this is a Supreme Court ruling in the mid-60s, allowed married couples to use birth control. Then, a few years later, Eisenstadt v. Baird, another Supreme Court ruling, allowed single women to use birth control, because these things used to be a crime in many states. And then we had Roe v. Wade, which, of course, legalized abortion. And then in 2003, we had Lawrence v. Texas, which got rid of the remaining laws in states criminalizing sodomy. All of those cases going back to Griswold, the rulings were based on privacy rights, constructive due process under the 14th Amendment. So there has been, for 50 years, a progression of successive Supreme Court rulings that help to liberate women, to treat them equally in marriages, to protect their reproductive freedoms, and then to decriminalize consensual private sexual relations between people, including members of the same sex. So this was a long process of change. It is simply not the case that marriage is monolithic and unchanging for millennia. For that matter, in the Bible, you find many cases of plural marriage, of polygamy, that is entirely approved of from the point of view of the writers of those texts. We also got a Spanish translation of our talking points. Igualdad de matrimonio, 10 puntos para cabildear a los miembros del Consejo de DC. And if you look on Google for the phrase Igualdad de matrimonio, you'll find this listed. So this is available, these talking points are available to people all over the world. That's an important point, is the tools that we've used did not take a lot of money. Setting up a website, using Twitter and Facebook, making the most of all of the arguments and information we're providing and organizing, by making them available online, by communicating via email to our email announcement list. These tools have greatly improved, they've leveraged, as it were, our limited resources. We're all volunteers, people with jobs, and so we were able to make the most of our small numbers by disseminating all of our information cheaply and easily using the new media. And that was a key part of our effort. But anyway, in terms of building and mobilizing our base, first of all, it was educating and providing the tools and the arguments that I showed you with these talking points. And we had town hall meetings. We had people in some groups doing canvassing, going, like standing outside subway stations and with getting people to sign petitions and handing out flyers to them. There were others in our coalition that attended meetings of ANCs around the city, or of the Democratic organizations in the wards, like the Ward 8 Democrats or the Ward 7 Democrats, and in some cases having them pass resolutions in support of marriage equality. And discussions with religious groups. We had this organization, DC Clergy United for Marriage Equality. These were a diverse group of clergy members, of faith leaders, that organized themselves. Their first meeting was held at the Howard University School of Divinity. And so they fanned out across the faith community and had oftentimes just a meeting over coffee with a few people. But there were this was true grassroots effort, grassroots discussion with people over the fact that we, in our crafting of the bill, were very respectful of religious diversity, including those who disapproved of same-sex marriage. Nobody was talking about imposing anything on any faith group or any church or temple. It was about the civil law. Now, one of the confusions that exist in the popular mind over marriage is caused by the fact that when an ordinary straight couple gets married, their minister, in addition to officiating at the religious ceremony, is acting as an agent for the state in signing the marriage license, as the officiant for the state. And so the religious dimension of marriage and the civil dimension of marriage are combined, and so people tend to confuse them with each other. But the fact is that that's simply a courtesy on the part of the government, and there's no necessary link between the two. So the only part we were dealing with in the law was to allow same-sex couples to get married under the civil law, not imposing anything on any religious group. What I say is there are three things that any minister must have the right to do: bar me from their sanctuary, deny me their sacraments, and denounce me from their pulpit. The day that they cannot do those three things, this stops being America. It is essential. It is a fundamental principle of this country that people have religious freedom. Now, what our opponents don't want to grasp is that they're not the only ones that have that freedom. All of us have that freedom, including people of a variety of faiths or of no faith. This is a country of significant religious diversity. And the opponents of marriage equality routinely talk as if there is one faith, theirs; one version of Christianity, theirs; one set of doctrines, theirs. And they talk as if it is obvious that if they're not allowed to impose their particular doctrines on the rest of the population using the power of the state, then their religious freedom is being infringed. So apparently the only people entitled to religious freedom are the most intolerant, the most fundamentalist, the most bossy right-wing Christians. There are many. There are liberal Christians. There are middle of the road. There are Jews, and there are Muslims, and there are Hindus. There are all sorts of people of different faiths, and all of us have the same rights under the First Amendment, not just the right wing of the Christian community. But these were messages that were most effectively delivered by our allied affirming ministers. Instead of having me talking to the Washington Post in response to the Archbishop of Washington, for example, the Catholic Archbishop, who was very strongly opposed to this, the co-pastors Dennis and Christine Wiley of Covenant Baptist Church, African-American ministers, would respond. Or then Episcopal presiding Bishop John Bryson Chain, the local Episcopal bishop, would respond. We had Pastor Rob Hardy's of All Souls Unitarian Church, 16th and Harvard Streets, Northwest. He would speak. There would be Reverend Graylin Hagler, who was this very charismatic preacher, this tall man with a booming voice, and would speak with great authority. We had a diversity of ministers who took the lead in this. It wasn't just, I went out and recruited some ministers. They organized themselves. We had a real coalition. This wasn't just a handful of people doing the organizing and then we sort of get some token allies. No, this was really a broad-based effort, and it was decades in the building because it was based on relationships that we had already put into place. You have to have trust to have an effective coalition. You cannot do that on the quick or on the cheap. You have to earn it over time by proving to people that you're for real and that the respect is there. And for there to be respect, it has to be a two-way street. You have to listen and you have to learn. As for identity, one of the key fundamental points in our struggle as LGBT citizens for equality, not just on the marriage front, is that we really do exist. Strange as it sounds, our opponents have relentlessly disputed our legitimate existence. 50 years ago or so, gay people were treated as mentally ill, as sinners, and as criminals. The mental illness part was removed from the Manual of Diagnostics and Statistical, anyway, from the American Psychological Association in 1973. So we were basically given a mass cure in 1973 due to efforts by LGBT activists to dispute the bad science, the junk science that was based on, and the bigotry that was based on. There have been members of various faith communities that have battled within their communities to make their own churches and synagogues and temples be more gay-affirming and welcoming. That is up to them, not to the government, but that has gone on since then. And there are many welcoming congregations. For example, somebody that's very famous, Jeremiah Wright, the former pastor of a church in South Chicago, his denomination was the United Church of Christ, which is one of the oldest gay-affirming congregations in the country. And he was a very gay-affirming pastor, had a very strong HIV ministry, for example, and we, in fact, have mutual friends. So there have been a lot of leadership on the faith community there. And finally, we were treated as criminals, as habitual criminals, because we were, anything other than the so-called missionary position between married straight couples was criminalized in many states. That ended in 2003 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Lawrence v. Texas that laws like that, disfavoring one particular group just because people disapprove of them, were not legitimate. And so we're no longer mentally ill, habitual criminals and sinners. Not at least universally in the latter case. Churches can say whatever they like, but that is not does not have the force of law in the civil law. A pastor can denounce us from his pulpit, but there are many other pastors that don't agree, and so we have that. So we've made a lot of progress culturally and legally. So that's one thing. We used we invoked and practiced fundamental American values. First of all, in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Happiness as we see that and define it for ourselves, not as some overlord dictates it paternalistically on our behalf, but our own happiness. That's a fundamental American value. Equal protection and due process of the law, that's in the Constitution in the 14th Amendment. And religious freedom, that's in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those are the first two of 6 different pieces of the First Amendment. The first two regarding religious freedom and the fact that the government cannot impose one sect's, S-E-C-T, the views of one sect over the rest of the population. Thomas Jefferson referred to the wall of separation between church and state. That is a direct quote from his letter to the Danbury Baptist Association at the beginning, I believe, of 1802, but it was a very old letter. Now, he was in Paris as our ambassador to France during the Constitution's drafting. His longtime friend, James Madison, was the principal drafter of the Constitution, but Jefferson was president when he wrote that letter to the Danbury Baptists, who were concerned about being discriminated against. And so President Jefferson wrote this letter to them in Connecticut, assuring them that the First Amendment in fact created a wall of separation between church and state. That is where that phrase comes from, Thomas Jefferson. So let our opponents try to explain how that is a big lie, because they're always making up stuff about the Founding Fathers. And I just cited a specific document from President Jefferson, who knew a great deal more about it than these guys do. How did you build relationships with or access to the government? Well, for many years on a whole series of issues, from repealing the law criminalizing sodomy, to responding to HIV and AIDS, to ending police harassment and entrapment of gay people, to ending discrimination against gay bars and clubs. There were a wide range of issues that GLAA had been, and other groups, have been fighting against for decades. And it wasn't just the one issue. All of our work advocating equality in terms of healthcare, public safety, business regulation, basic human rights, and enforcement, all of these efforts laid the groundwork for the biggest one of all, which was the effort for marriage equality. Discrimination based on sexual orientation was prohibited beginning in 1973, when the first version of the D.C. Human Rights Act was passed before the Home Rule government as Title 31. After the first elected city legislature, the D.C. Council was elected in 1976. In 1977, after they were all sworn in and began their work, they repassed the Human Rights Act to put their stamp on it, the Home Rule elected government stamp on it. So that's why there's an original one in 73 called Title 31, and then the Human Rights Act of 1977. Gay people were included in that from the outset. And in 1972, we saw to it that anti-gay discrimination was prohibited in D.C. public schools. So this effort, in terms of legal effort within D.C., goes back more than 4 decades. It didn't just start when we decided we wanted marriage equality. So relationships were built with our local elected officials and the class of people that was involved in local politics, both activists, candidates, opinion makers, reporters. One of the things that GLAA has done regularly is not only evaluating and doing ratings of candidates for DC Council, mayor, and for many years the school board candidates. We would distribute questionnaires to the candidates, ask them their positions on a variety of issues, and also what their records were, what they had done to help our community on these issues. And so we did that to track candidates and to educate these people, not only candidates, but the general public, other activists, reporters, opinion makers. And for at least, well, for about 18 or 20 years, we've also done, in every election cycle, a policy brief. We would, in several different areas, we would write up summaries of our policy positions. And in the last couple of elections, we've also, at the front of our policy brief, listed action items. Pass this particular bill, pass that particular bill, do this regulatory action as a summary. And so we make it readily available on our website at glaa.org. And people can use that also as advocacy tools. And it also makes our questionnaire an open book test for candidates because they don't have to guess what we're looking for. We tell them what we're looking for. We have 90 footnotes with links in our policy brief, which is online. So they can really do an in-depth study. In other words, we show our work. We back up our claims. We cite our sources. We make the argument cogently on issue after issue. So this is an educational tool and not just for advancing policy. So we're building relationships of trust with public officials, with policymakers, and those that report on it. And so that includes using the media. One of our longstanding allies, for example, is Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post columnist Colby King. He has been a very strong ally of ours. And one of the things he praised was some years ago, at the end of 2009, beginning of 2010, there was an effort, there was an advertising campaign by these ministers that were opposing us on the sides of buses. Let the people vote, meaning let the public vote directly on marriage equality. Now, we think, because we've done the polling, that we would win such a fight, but we didn't think it was appropriate to have the public voting directly on other people's rights. You shouldn't be voting on people's basic civil rights. But our opponents had the right to publish and to run those ads against us under the First Amendment. Now, the First Amendment doesn't obligate a private newspaper, privately owned newspaper, to run your ads with them if they don't agree with you. But the Metro, which controls the Metro buses, is a quasi-governmental agency, which means it is covered by the First Amendment, which prohibits the government from censoring you, from picking and choosing which messages it approves of and doesn't approve of. So, knowing this, because there was some gay people that wanted to pressure the Metro to censor these ads, to stop letting these ads run, these anti-gay ads. I contacted the ACLU locally and other people who supported free expression and freedom of speech. And we put together, I drafted a joint letter that we all signed to the Metro board, urging them not to respond to these other gay people that wanted to censor those obnoxious ads, because our strong belief that we share with the ACLU is the proper response to hateful speech is more speech in response, not censorship. Because we're a minority. If we have the government censoring people, we're likely to be the ones to be censored. And Colby King devoted his first column that year in 2010 to praising my and my colleagues' efforts. In other words, he said, we're doing it the right way. We're not trying to simply impose our views on others, we're trying to persuade. We are not shutting down the discussion, we're not trying to silence other voices. We're trusting in the good people of Washington to hear all sides and to come to their own conclusion. That's what we did, and they agreed with us, and every year they're agreeing with us more. I'm very proud of that, but that was part of the relationship we built with somebody like a Colby King. And I talked earlier about resources. The new media, the online resources, internet, email, Twitter, Facebook, websites. We are all volunteers. We don't have that much money, and we didn't have to spend a lot of money. We had to have spend our own time and energy and do our homework. And we held meetings. We occasionally, leaders of the coalition effort, would have dinner together at the DuPont Italian Kitchen or some place like that to touch base to make sure that we were working in concert and not at cross purposes. Just keeping the avenues of communication open and sort of checking one another. And because we had discussed this and planned the way for this for so many years before that, we knew what we were dealing with. We had done our homework, we knew about public opinion, we knew what some of the sensitive points were. For example, if you talk to, at least 7 years ago, if you talk to, let's say, African-American church-going women over 40 who were married, and you raised the comparison between same-sex couples and the Loving v. Virginia Supreme Court ruling of 1967, which got rid of the remaining anti-miscegenation laws, the laws that had, in states that had prohibited interracial marriage. The legal similarities between the two issues are very, very close. But many African-American women resent some guy taking their man. They resent the comparison between gay marriage and interracial marriage, because some of them don't like interracial marriages because there's few enough marriageable black men and they don't want some white woman stealing their men from them. Now, you can't legislate love, and so this is somewhat irrational, but you don't lead on a sensitive point. You don't lead on a sore point. The first point you want to make isn't something that's going to piss somebody off. So the point is, when you're talking to people, you should learn about them first to understand what their sensitivities are, what their background is, the struggle they've gone through, and so we had to listen, do our homework, and coalition isn't just get a bunch of people to help you do what you want to do. You have to help them. You have to work together. It's a two-way street. And so you have to hold on. You know, like that song, hold on, you know, keep your eyes on the prize. Building trust is difficult. Years ago, the DC Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gay Men held a fundraiser to raise money, and they raised about $5,000 for the local branch of the NAACP, whose president at the time was Pastor Morris Sharon of Israel Baptist Church, which is off Rhode Island Avenue in Northeast Washington. He, at the time, refused to accept their check because he disapproved of homosexuality. And then a few years after that, the political director of the local NAACP, under him was Mark Thompson. Mark organized a police task force to help push for setting up a police commission. And he reached out, with Pastor Sharon's approval, he reached out to me and to GLAA to be part of that. And for the following 15 years or longer, we worked together on police issues to create a broad-based coalition. And over that time, and then Mark has a radio program, over that time, I built a relationship with Pastor Sharon. It wasn't like I was always getting into a discussion of gay rights with him. It was just, we would talk about, when we would run into each other, we would talk about what Mark was doing lately. I ran into him at an event. It was just a friendly holding on and building trust over time, so that when he came into Mark's studio on election night in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president, and he sat next to me and I gave him one of my power bars that I had to get through that long night. And I showed him on my laptop the headlines from the Nairobi newspaper from the next morning, where it was already daylight. And we were all celebrating this extraordinary achievement. It wasn't about gay stuff, but you build trust over time. You can't do that like get it out of a box and pour some instant thing and add water and have trust. It builds over time where somebody figures out that you really do mean it when you talk about your commitment to equality, and the fact that you've bothered to do your homework and understand prior struggles. Religiously, socially, culturally, economically, and so our coalition had to reflect that diversity. When we set up a new organization to run any prospective campaign that might be necessary, that diversity had to be built into the structure of it, not just have somebody invited to an already existing organization. Because if you want me to really have complete buy-in to your effort, it has to be our effort. It's not like you in your state of privilege, in your position of privilege, invite poor little old me to sit at the table. No, we are together designing the table. That is essential for any real coalition, and we did it. I'm very proud of that. The Black Civil Rights Movement and the Women's Rights Movement both preceded, for the most part, the Gay Rights Movement, although the Gay Rights Movement began actually around 1950 when the Mattachine Society was organized in California. And there was more activity in the 1960s. Frank Kameny, the late Frank Kameny here in Washington, D.C., set up the Mattachine Society of Washington in, I believe, 1961. Then Stonewall, the Stonewall uprising in Greenwich Village, New York City, happened on the night of the 27th and 28th of June in 1969. That was not the beginning of the modern gay rights movement, but it was a crucial flashpoint that helped to broaden the movement from a relative handful of people and organizations into this burgeoning movement across the country. And so there were gay people organizing at the same time, women were organizing, and African Americans were organizing, but the significant advances for gay rights happened after Stonewall, for the most part, and we were inspired by and informed by those struggles that came before us. There have often been objections to what people call equating the gay struggle to the Black civil rights struggle over the years. I've never heard anybody equate them. I've heard comparisons, but the fact is that the most consistently pro-gay caucus within the Congress on gay issues is the Congressional Black Caucus. I already mentioned John Lewis, who was a great hero of the civil rights movement, who was nearly killed on at least two different occasions during the Freedom Rides in 1961, where he participated, and at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on the 7th of March 1965. In fact, he was clubbed over the head with a truncheon, a police truncheon, and his skull was cracked open, but he was still after that helping all these other people because he was one of the leaders of it, and so he felt responsible, although he was, I think, he was maybe out of college at that point. He was quite a young man in his 20s. And he didn't go to the hospital readily. Fortunately, he survived and is a member of Congress. But there is strong support for gay equality on the part of that very prominent black group, as there is on the part of the NAACP. Benjamin Todd Jellis last May, when he announced the national NAACP's endorsement of marriage equality, got emotional, quite emotional, because he himself is biracial, and he remembered his parents' marriage had been illegal at the time in some jurisdictions, and he talked about that. Brenton Ayanbadejo, a linebacker for the NFL champion Baltimore Ravens, grew up biracial and is very strongly committed. In fact, he and Chris Kluwe of the Minnesota Vikings jointly filed an amicus brief before the Supreme Court in one of the marriage cases that's currently before the court. defending our equality. So we have real diversity undergirding our efforts, and that's something that didn't happen overnight. That's happened because of conversations that happened all over the country. But all struggles are different. But in the original civil rights movement, the leading strategist and organizer, I think, is widely recognized as having been Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin helped Dr. King organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference during the Montgomery bus boycott. This was in 1956, the year I was born. He was openly gay. And then he organized the March on Washington in 1963. He was the lead organizer. The official person in charge was A. Philip Randolph, who had organized a previous March on Washington in 1943. And they put him officially in charge, but the first thing he did was to put Bayard Rustin in charge of it. And our congresswoman here in the district, Eleanor Holmes Norton, was involved in helping write John Lewis's speech for the March on Washington. I think he's the only speaker that's still alive. And it was considered very radical a speech. And the Archbishop of Washington, John O'Boyle, threatened not to give the invocation unless that was toned down. And but anyway, so and Eleanor talks about Bayard Rustin. So we are very proud of Bayard Rustin's role in the original civil rights movement. Gay people were involved in that struggle. Gay women were involved in the women's rights movement. The LGBT community crosses every other line of diversity that the wider population has. We are racially diverse, we are diverse in terms of incomes, we are diverse in every respect. And it was all of us that worked together to win this.